The notice taped to my front door fluttered in the October breeze, threatening to tear loose from its position, and I snatched it before the wind could carry it into my yard, where I just spent 3 hours blowing leaves. The letterhead read, Meadowbrook Community HOA, in pretentious gold script, and my stomach dropped as I scanned the contents. $200. They were fining me $200 for blowing leaves onto the shared walking path that ran between my property and the Hendersons' place next door. I stood there on my front porch in Columbus, Ohio, staring at that piece of paper like it might spontaneously combust if I glared hard enough. The signature at the bottom belonged to Deborah Ferguson, the HOA president who'd moved into the neighborhood about 5 years ago and immediately made it her personal mission to enforce every ridiculous rule she could dream up. But this was different. This wasn't about my mailbox being the wrong shade of black or my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall. This was about property I'd built with my own 2 hands back in 1987. My name is Gerald Richardson, and I've lived at 4782 Pinewood Drive for 38 years. I bought this house when I was 26 years old, fresh out of the Marines and ready to settle down. The property cost me $43,000 back then, which felt like all the money in the world. The neighborhood hadn't been part of any HOA in those days. We were just regular folks living our lives without someone breathing down our necks about leaf placement. I walked back into my house and headed straight for the basement. My knees protested the descent down the wooden stairs, reminding me that I wasn't that 26-year-old Marine anymore. I was 64 now, with gray hair and reading glasses I kept losing. But my memory was sharp as ever, and I remembered exactly where I'd stored the documentation for that path. The boxes sat in the far corner, covered in dust and stacked 3 high. I'd labeled them in black marker decades ago when I still cared about organization. The one I wanted read, House Docs 1985-1990, in my younger self's handwriting. I pulled it down, disturbing enough dust to make me sneeze twice, and carried it over to the old card table I used for sorting through junk. Inside, manila folders held everything from appliance warranties to property surveys. I rifled through them until I found what I needed. The folder was labeled Walking Path Project, and inside were the original plans, receipts, and most importantly, the deed showing that I'd financed, designed, and constructed that entire path myself back in May of 1987. The story behind the path was simple enough. My neighbor at the time, old Mr. Henderson Sr., had trouble with his knees even worse than mine are now. He used a cane to get around, and the terrain between our properties was rough, full of roots and uneven ground. His grandson lived 3 houses down, and Mr. Henderson liked to visit him every evening for dinner. I'd watched him struggle across that distance one too many times, so I decided to do something about it. I'd spent 2 months that spring and summer digging, grading, laying gravel, and finally pouring concrete for a 4-foot-wide path that stretched from the sidewalk near my driveway all the way down past 6 properties to where it connected with the main neighborhood walkway. I'd paid for every bag of concrete, every load of gravel, every tool rental. The receipts in my hand showed over $3,000 in expenses, which was serious money in 1987. The deed was even more interesting. I'd had a lawyer friend help me draw it up, establishing the path as a public easement that I maintained ownership of while granting perpetual access to neighborhood residents. The document clearly stated that Gerald Richardson of 4782 Pinewood Drive held full ownership rights to the path structure itself, with responsibility for maintenance and the right to make decisions about its use. I made copies of everything at the library the next morning. The librarian, a young woman named Sarah who'd helped me learn to use the scanner when they'd gone digital, didn't ask questions when I spent 45 minutes copying documents. I left with a thick folder full of evidence and headed straight to the HOA office. The Meadowbrook Community HOA operated out of a converted house on the edge of the neighborhood. Someone had tried to make it look official by painting it beige and adding a brass plaque by the door, but it still looked like someone's grandmother's house. I'd been inside exactly twice in the 5 years since the HOA had formed. Both times had been to argue about stupid violations I shouldn't have received. Deborah Ferguson sat behind a cheap desk in what used to be the living room, typing away on a computer with 2 fingers like she'd never taken a typing class in her life. She looked up when I walked in, and her expression shifted from neutral to annoyed in about half a second. "Mr. Richardson," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that made my teeth hurt. "I assume you're here about your violation notice." "I am," I said, staying calm. I'd learned a long time ago that losing your temper with people like Deborah only gave them ammunition. "I'd like to discuss this fine for blowing leaves onto the shared path." She folded her hands on the desk like a school principal about to lecture a misbehaving student. Deborah was probably in her early 50s, with the kind of precise haircut that required weekly salon visits and enough jewelry to stock a small store. Everything about her screamed, "I need to speak to the manager," even when she was supposedly the manager herself. "The rules are very clear," she said. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Community Guidelines states that residents must not deposit lawn waste, including leaves, onto common areas. The shared walking path is classified as a common area, and you were observed on October 14th blowing leaves directly onto that path. "I understand what the rule says," I replied, setting my folder on her desk. "What I'm questioning is the classification of that path as a common area. Because according to these documents, I own that path." Deborah's eyes narrowed. She didn't touch the folder. "That's absurd. The path has been maintained by the community since before I moved here. It's obviously common property." "It's maintained by me," I corrected her. "I've been fixing cracks, clearing snow, and yes, occasionally blowing leaves onto it for 38 years. I built it in 1987, paid for it myself, and have the deed right here to prove ownership." I opened the folder and pulled out the deed copy, laying it in front of her. She finally looked down at it, her lips pressing into a thin line as she scanned the text. I watched her face cycle through several emotions, including confusion, irritation, and something that might have been panic. "This is dated 1987, she said slowly, like that somehow invalidated it. "Yes. That's when I built it. But the HOA was established in 2020. All common areas were documented at that time, including this path. You can't document something as HOA property if it never belonged to the HOA in the first place," I said. "This deed was filed with the county recorder's office 38 years ago. It predates your HOA by 33 years. You have no claim to it." Deborah's face flushed red. She picked up the deed copy and read it more carefully, her eyes moving back and forth across the page. I could practically see her trying to find some loophole, some way to dismiss what was right in front of her. "This will need to be reviewed by our legal counsel," she finally said, setting the paper down like it had personally offended her. "Fine. Review it. But that fine is void, and I expect it to be rescinded by the end of the week." "The fine stands until the board reviews your claim," she snapped, dropping the false sweetness entirely. "If you refuse to pay, we can place a lien on your property." I leaned forward, keeping my voice level. You try to place a lien on my property over a fine based on a false claim of ownership, and I'll have my lawyer file so many countersuits you'll be dealing with paperwork for the next 5 years. I'm 64 years old, Deborah. I'm retired. I have nothing but time. We stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, she picked up the folder and stood. The board meets next Tuesday evening at 7. You're welcome to present your case then. I'll be there. I left the office feeling simultaneously vindicated and annoyed. The fact that I had to defend my ownership of something I'd built nearly 4 decades ago was ridiculous, but at least I had the documentation to back up my claim. I figured the board would review the deed, realize their mistake, and rescind the fine. How wrong I was. The next few days passed normally. I raked more leaves, watched some baseball, and had dinner with my daughter Rachel, who lived about 20 minutes away in Dublin. She'd inherited my stubborn streak, which made me proud, and when I told her about the HOA situation, she immediately offered to help. "Dad, that's insane," she said over pasta at her kitchen table. Her 2 kids, my grandchildren, were at soccer practice with her husband. "Can they really fine you for using your own property?" "They're trying to," I said, "but I've got all the original paperwork. It should be straightforward." Rachel shook her head, twirling spaghetti on her fork. "Nothing with HOAs is straightforward. My friend Lisa dealt with hers for 2 years over a fence dispute. These people are insane. I was in the Marines. I've dealt with worse than Deborah Ferguson. The Marines had rules that made sense. HOAs are run by people who peaked in high school and want to feel powerful again." She had a point, but I stayed optimistic. The Tuesday board meeting would sort everything out. Tuesday evening arrived cold and drizzly, typical Ohio weather for late October. I drove the 3 blocks to the HOA office rather than walk in the rain, my folder of documents on the passenger seat. I'd added more evidence over the weekend, including photographs I'd dug out of old albums showing me, and several neighbors working on the path construction. There was even one of Mr. Henderson Sr. standing on the completed path, grinning and holding up his cane in triumph. The meeting room was packed. I recognized most of the faces, neighbors I'd known for years and some newer residents I'd only seen in passing. The board sat at a folding table at the front, 5 people including Deborah in the center. To her right was Tom Keller, a real estate agent who'd moved in 3 years ago. To her left sat Margaret Chen, a retired teacher who'd been in the neighborhood almost as long as I had. The other 2 board members were Steve Palermo and Linda Vasquez, both relative newcomers. I'd expected Margaret to be reasonable. She remembered the old days before the HOA, remembered when neighbors helped each other instead of fining each other. But when I caught her eye, she looked away quickly, and my stomach sank. Deborah had gotten to her somehow. The meeting started with routine business. Approval of last month's minutes, financial reports, discussion of holiday decoration guidelines. I sat in the back and waited, watching Deborah run the meeting with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced her power moves in the mirror. Finally, we reached new business, and Deborah looked directly at me. "We have a property dispute to address. Gerald Richardson has contested his violation fine regarding leaf disposal on the shared walking path. Mr. Richardson claims to own the path in question. Gerald, would you like to present your case?" I stood and walked to the front, folder in hand. 20 pairs of eyes followed me. I laid out the deed first, then the receipts, then the construction photos. I explained the history, how I'd built the path for Mr. Henderson, how I'd maintained it for nearly 4 decades, how the deed clearly established my ownership. "This path predates your HOA by 33 years, I concluded. "It's not common property. It never was. I granted a public easement for neighborhood use, but I retained ownership and control. The fine should be rescinded. I returned to my seat. Deborah shuffled through the copies I'd provided, her expression unreadable. Tom Keller leaned over to whisper something to her. Steve and Linda looked confused. Margaret still wouldn't meet my eyes. The board will need to discuss this, Deborah announced. We'll take a 15-minute recess. The 5 board members retreated to the back office. The rest of us sat in uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 4 houses down from me, gave me an encouraging smile. Bill Morrison, a guy about my age who'd moved in during the 90s, gave me a thumbs up. But others looked skeptical, like I was making trouble over nothing. The 15 minutes stretched to 30. Finally, the board members filed back in and took their seats. Deborah's expression told me everything I needed to know before she even opened her mouth. The board has reviewed your documentation, she said formally. While we acknowledge that you financed and constructed the path in 1987, we find that your granting of a public easement effectively transferred the path to community ownership. When the HOA was established in 2020, all community-owned properties and easements fell under HOA jurisdiction. Therefore, the path is now HOA property and the fine stands. The room erupted. Several people started talking at once. I sat frozen, trying to process what I'd just heard. It was the most twisted logic I'd encountered outside of military bureaucracy. That's not how easements work, I shouted over the noise. A public easement grants access. It doesn't transfer ownership. The deed clearly states that I retain ownership. The board's decision is final, Deborah said, banging a gavel that appeared from nowhere. If you wish to appeal, you may submit a written request within 30 days. This meeting is adjourned. People filed out, some shooting me sympathetic looks, others avoiding eye contact entirely. I approached the board table where Deborah was gathering papers. This is garbage and you know it, I said, keeping my voice low but firm. That's not a legal interpretation. You can't just declare something yours because you want it. The board has spoken, she replied without looking up. Pay the fine by the end of the month or face additional penalties. I'll be talking to a lawyer. That's your right. I left before I said something I'd regret. The rain had picked up, and I sat in my car for a long moment, watching water stream down the windshield. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I called Robert Mills, a lawyer who'd handled my will and a property dispute with the city about 10 years back. His secretary scheduled me for that afternoon, and I showed up with my entire folder of documentation, plus notes from the board meeting. Robert was in his late 50s, with gray temples and reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He'd been practicing law in Columbus for 30 years, and I trusted him to give me straight answers. He reviewed everything carefully, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. The whole process took about 40 minutes. Finally, he set down the last document and looked at me over his glasses. They don't have a leg to stand on, he said flatly. This is one of the clearest cases of property ownership I've seen. The deed is properly filed, the language is unambiguous, and easements absolutely do not transfer ownership. Any first-year law student could win this case. So what do I do? I'll write a letter to the HOA on your behalf, explaining in legal terms why their interpretation is wrong and why the fine must be rescinded. If they refuse, we file suit. Given how clear-cut this is, they'll likely back down once they realize you're serious. How much will this cost me? The letter is $200. If we have to file suit, we're looking at a few thousand in legal fees, but we'd include those fees in the lawsuit. You'd almost certainly recover them. I authorized him to write the letter. He promised to have it drafted and sent by the end of the week. I left his office feeling better than I had since finding that notice on my door. Robert's letter arrived at the HOA office the following Monday via certified mail. I knew because Deborah called me that afternoon, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Having your lawyer write threatening letters doesn't change the board's decision," she said without preamble. "It's not a threatening letter. It's a legal explanation of why you're wrong." "We're not wrong. We had our attorney review the situation, and she agrees with our interpretation." I doubted that seriously. "Then you should have no problem going to court. Is that really what you want, to sue your neighbors over $200? It's not about the money, Deborah. It's about you claiming ownership of something that's mine. What's next? Are you going to claim my driveway belongs to the HOA, my garage? Don't be ridiculous." "I'm not the one being ridiculous here." She hung up on me. I called Robert and told him to prepare the lawsuit. The next few weeks were tense. The fine deadline passed, and the HOA sent another notice threatening additional penalties and the promised lien. Robert filed suit in Franklin County Court, naming the HOA and Deborah Ferguson personally as defendants. The claim was simple: declaratory judgment confirming my ownership of the path, plus compensation for legal fees and the invalid fine. The lawsuit had an immediate effect on the neighborhood. People took sides. Some supported me, recognizing the absurdity of the HOA's position. Others thought I was making a big deal out of nothing and should just pay the fine to keep the peace. A few seemed to enjoy the drama, gossiping about it at every opportunity. Bill Morrison stopped by one evening with a six-pack of beer. We sat on my back deck in the cold November air, watching the sun set. "You're doing the right thing," he said, opening his second beer. "Someone needs to stand up to that woman. She's been out of control since day one." "I just want what's mine," I said. "I don't understand why that's controversial. It's not about right or wrong with people like her. It's about control. You're challenging her authority and she can't stand it. The court will settle it, probably. But she'll make your life hell in the meantime. Watch out for more violations. She'll be looking for any excuse." He wasn't wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more violation notices. One claimed my house numbers weren't properly lit, even though they were the same numbers I'd had for 15 years. Another said my trash cans were visible from the street, despite being in the same spot they'd always been. The third was for having unauthorized decorations, because I'd put up a small American flag for Veterans Day. Each violation came with a $50 fine. I documented everything and forwarded it all to Robert, who added harassment claims to the lawsuit. The whole situation was spiraling into something bigger than I'd intended, but I refused to back down. The court date was set for January 15th. That gave both sides time to prepare their arguments. Robert assured me we had a strong case, but court was never a certainty. Judges had bad days. Opposing counsel could get lucky. Anything could happen. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had become increasingly divided. Someone spray-painted "HOA Nazi" on the office building's door, which I had nothing to do with but got blamed for anyway. A counter-petition started circulating, calling for my removal from the neighborhood, which made no legal sense but demonstrated how worked up people had gotten. Rachel called me almost daily, worried about the stress this was causing. My son David, who lived in Phoenix, offered to fly out for moral support. I told them both I was fine, that I'd dealt with worse in the Marines, but honestly, the constant tension was wearing on me. December arrived with early snow. I cleared my driveway and, out of habit, cleared the walking path too. Someone posted a photo in the neighborhood Facebook group showing me with my snow shovel on the path, with a caption asking why I was maintaining HOA property if I claimed to own it. I didn't bother explaining that I'd been maintaining it for decades out of courtesy to my neighbors. Christmas came and went quietly. I spent it with Rachel's family, trying not to think about the upcoming court date. My grandson asked why I was distracted, and I told him I had some grown-up business to handle. He asked if I was in trouble, and I assured him I wasn't. His sister, my granddaughter, told me she'd heard her friend's mom say I was suing the HOA, and was that true? The whole neighborhood really was talking. January arrived cold and bitter. The court date loomed. Robert and I met twice to prepare, going over potential questions and reviewing our evidence. He remained confident, but I'd learned that confidence didn't always translate to victory. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about that summer in 1987. I could still remember the feeling of accomplishment when we'd poured the last section of concrete. Mr. Henderson had insisted on paying me back, but I'd refused. It had been a gift to the neighborhood, a small way to make life better for everyone. Now that gift was being used against me. The Franklin County Courthouse was downtown, an imposing building that always made me feel small. Robert met me on the steps at 8:30, briefcase in hand and wearing his court suit. We went through security and found our assigned courtroom on the 3rd floor. Deborah was already there with the HOA's attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s named Patricia Holmes. I'd done some research on her. She specialized in property law and had a good reputation. The HOA had spent money on quality representation, which told me they were taking this seriously. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood paneling and uncomfortable benches. A few neighbors had shown up to watch, including Bill Morrison and Mrs. Patterson. Margaret Chen was there too, sitting on the HOA's side, which stung more than I wanted to admit. Judge Andrew Corrigan entered at 9:15. He was in his 60s, with completely white hair and a no-nonsense expression. The bailiff called the court to order, and we began. Patricia Holmes went first, arguing that the public easement had effectively made the path community property, which had been absorbed into HOA jurisdiction when the association was formed. She cited several cases involving public easements and property transfer, speaking confidently about legal precedents and property law. Robert countered by walking through my documentation piece by piece. He showed the deed, explaining in simple terms how easements work. He showed the receipts, proving I'd financed the construction. He showed the photos, demonstrating that this was a private project I'd undertaken for the community's benefit. He cited cases that contradicted Holmes's precedents, showing that easements do not transfer ownership. Judge Corrigan asked questions of both sides. He seemed particularly interested in the deed's specific language and the circumstances of the HOA's formation. He wanted to know if the HOA had ever approached me about the path before the fine, and I testified that they hadn't. He asked Deborah directly why the HOA assumed ownership without verifying the property records, and she gave some vague answer about inherited assets. The hearing lasted about 3 hours. When both sides had presented everything, Judge Corrigan said he'd review the materials and issue a written decision within 2 weeks. We were dismissed. Outside the courtroom, Deborah and Patricia Holmes left quickly without speaking to us. Robert seemed pleased with how things had gone, but cautioned me against assuming anything until the decision came through. The judge asked good questions, he said. I think he understood our position, but you never know until the ruling comes. I drove home exhausted and went to bed at 7 that evening, sleeping for 12 straight hours. The waiting was torture. Every day I checked the mail, hoping for the court's decision. A week passed, then 10 days. On day 12, the envelope arrived. My hand shook as I opened it. The ruling was written in dense legal language that took me 3 readings to fully understand, but the conclusion was clear. Judge Corrigan found in my favor on all counts. The decision was thorough. He confirmed that the deed was valid and properly filed, that public easements do not transfer ownership, and that the HOA had no legal basis for claiming the path as their property. He invalidated the fine, awarded me my legal fees, and included a strongly worded paragraph about HOAs respecting existing property rights and conducting proper due diligence before making ownership claims. Furthermore, he ordered the HOA to pay an additional $2,000 in damages for the harassment violations I'd received after the initial dispute. He didn't use the word harassment in the ruling, but he noted that the pattern of violations following the initial dispute appeared punitive and was not supported by evidence of actual rule breaking. I called Robert immediately. He'd received his copy and was equally pleased. "This is as complete a victory as you could hope for," he said. "The language is strong enough that it should discourage any appeals, though they have the right to file one." Next, I called Rachel. She screamed with joy so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She promised to come over that evening with the kids to celebrate. The court's decision had to be posted publicly, and by evening, the neighborhood Facebook group was exploding. Some people congratulated me. Others complained that I'd wasted everyone's time and money over petty nonsense. Someone posted the actual ruling, and watching people realize just how thoroughly the judge had sided with me was deeply satisfying. Deborah remained silent online, but I heard through Bill Morrison that she was furious. The HOA had to pay my legal fees plus damages, which totaled just over $5,000. That money came from HOA dues, meaning everyone's fees would likely go up to cover it. While I felt bad about that, it wasn't my fault the board had made such a stupid decision. I thought that would be the end of it. I was very wrong. 2 weeks later, someone vandalized the path. They'd taken spray paint and written obscenities across multiple sections, plus "thanks for raising our dues" in large red letters. They'd also dumped oil in several spots, leaving dark stains on the concrete. I called the police. Officer Daniel Santos took my report, photographed everything, and asked if I had any idea who might be responsible. I told him about the HOA situation and the court ruling. He wrote it all down but said without witnesses or camera footage, there wasn't much they could do. "I'll file the report and we'll increase patrols in the area," he said. "If it happens again, consider installing security cameras." I cleaned the path myself over the next 2 days, using paint remover and concrete cleaner. The oil stains were stubborn and wouldn't completely come out. The whole time I worked, I felt angry and disappointed. This path had been a gift, and someone had turned it into a weapon. Bill Morrison helped me install 2 security cameras the following weekend, aimed at the path sections closest to my house. They weren't expensive, just basic motion-activated cameras that recorded to a cloud service, but they'd catch anyone trying something again. The HOA had their next monthly meeting in early February. I didn't attend, but Rachel did on my behalf. She reported that Deborah had been forced to explain the court ruling and the financial impact. Several residents demanded her resignation. Others defended her, saying I'd created the situation by being stubborn. The meeting apparently devolved into a shouting match before someone called for a vote of no confidence. The vote failed, but barely. Deborah retained her position as president, but her authority was clearly weakened. Margaret Chen resigned from the board entirely, telling people she couldn't support the direction things were going. 2 other board members followed her out within a week. This left the HOA in chaos. They needed board members to function, but no one wanted to volunteer given the toxic atmosphere. An emergency election was scheduled for March, and in the meantime, basic HOA functions ground to a halt. I tried to stay out of it and focus on my own life. Winter slowly gave way to early spring. The vandalism didn't repeat, though I kept the cameras running. I received no more violation notices. For a while, things seemed calm. Then in mid-March, I discovered someone had filed a mechanic's lien against my property. The claim stated that the path required $20,000 in repairs due to deferred maintenance and structural deficiencies, and that as the owner, I was responsible for those repairs. If I failed to address them, the lien could eventually lead to foreclosure. The lien had been filed by something called Meadowbrook Path Maintenance LLC, a company I'd never heard of. A little research revealed it was a shell company created 2 weeks earlier, with Deborah Ferguson listed as the registered agent. This was war. I called Robert immediately. He was already aware of the lien. The court had notified him when it was filed. His voice was tight with controlled anger. "This is fraudulent," he said. "There's no legitimate basis for this lien. She's abusing the legal system to harass you after losing in court. What do I do?" "We file to have the lien removed, and then we file criminal charges. This crosses the line from civil dispute into fraud and harassment. She's falsified a claim to place a lien on your property. That's illegal. Will the police actually do anything?" With the documented history of this dispute and the clear evidence of retaliation, yes, I think they will. Robert moved fast. Within 2 days, he'd filed the motion to remove the lien and had scheduled a meeting with the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office to discuss criminal charges. He also sent a letter to Patricia Holmes, informing her that her client was engaging in criminal activity and that she might want to consider withdrawing from representation. The prosecutor's office took the case seriously. The assistant prosecutor assigned to review it, a woman named Jennifer Schultz, looked at the timeline of events and agreed it appeared to be retaliatory harassment. She scheduled interviews with me, Robert, and several neighbors who'd witnessed the escalating situation. Meanwhile, the motion to remove the lien went before Judge Corrigan again. He was not pleased. The hearing was brief and his ruling was immediate. The lien was fraudulent, it was removed, and he was referring the matter to law enforcement for investigation. He also sanctioned Deborah personally, ordering her to pay $2,000 for abusing the court system. That evening, 2 police officers showed up at Deborah's house with a warrant. I heard about it from Bill Morrison, who'd watched the whole thing. They'd confiscated her computer and documents related to the shell company. She'd been questioned for over 2 hours at the police station before being released. The neighborhood erupted again. This was no longer a civil dispute about leaves and paths. This was potential criminal charges against the HOA president. The emergency board election suddenly became critical. Everyone wanted Deborah out, even her former supporters. The election happened in late March. Over 100 residents showed up, the most participation the neighborhood had seen in years. Bill Morrison ran for president and won easily. 3 new board members were elected, all people who'd publicly opposed Deborah's handling of the situation with me. Deborah herself was voted out entirely, not even retaining a regular board position. The new board's first action was to issue a formal apology to me and acknowledge my ownership of the path. They also voted to have the HOA pay for professional repairs to the vandalism damage, since it had occurred during the dispute they'd caused. I accepted the apology, but declined the repair money. I'd already fixed it myself. In April, the prosecutor's office filed charges against Deborah Ferguson. 3 counts: filing a false lien, fraud, and criminal harassment. Each was a misdemeanor, but together they carried potential jail time and significant fines. Her attorney worked out a plea deal. Deborah pled guilty to 1 count of filing a false lien in exchange for the other charges being dropped. She was sentenced to 6 months probation, a $5,000 fine, and 100 hours of community service. She was also ordered to have no contact with me and was permanently banned from holding any HOA position in Meadowbrook Community. The day her sentencing was announced, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that it was finally over, but sadness that it had come to this. All of this pain and conflict could have been avoided if she'd just listened in the first place, if she'd checked the property records, if she'd been willing to admit a mistake. Summer arrived warm and beautiful. I maintained the path like I always had, clearing it after storms and filling small cracks before they became large problems. People used it daily, walking dogs or jogging or just strolling with family. No one bothered me about leaves anymore. Bill Morrison turned out to be a good HOA president. He focused on actual neighborhood improvement rather than petty rule enforcement. Violation notices dropped dramatically. The neighborhood slowly healed from the divisions the conflict had created. Rachel and the kids came over one Saturday in June for a barbecue. While I grilled burgers, my grandson asked about the path. He'd heard stories at school, distorted versions of what had happened. "Why did you fight so hard over it, Grandpa?" he asked. "It's just a sidewalk." I thought about how to explain it in a way he'd understand. "It wasn't about the sidewalk itself," I said finally. "It was about someone trying to take something that wasn't theirs. Your teacher ever try to take credit for your homework?" He nodded vigorously. "Yeah, and it made me so mad. Same idea, but bigger. I built that path to help people. I spent my own money and my own time. When someone tried to claim they owned it and tell me I couldn't use my own property the way I wanted, I had to stand up for what was right. You can't let people push you around when you know you're right. Did you win because you're a Marine?" My granddaughter asked. I laughed. "The Marines taught me not to quit when things get hard, but I won because I had proof, because the law was on my side, and because I was willing to fight for what was mine." Rachel smiled at me from the porch. "And because you're stubborn as hell." "That too." Life settled into a comfortable rhythm as summer progressed. I took the grandkids to Columbus Clippers games. I worked in my garden. I had coffee with Bill Morrison most Saturday mornings, talking about neighborhood business and solving the world's problems. The path continued to serve its purpose, connecting neighbors and making the neighborhood a little more walkable. In August, I received a letter from Patricia Holmes, Deborah's former attorney. It was brief and professional, informing me that Deborah was selling her house and moving out of state. She'd accepted a job in Tennessee and would be gone by September. The letter didn't ask for anything or offer anything. It was purely informational. I suspected it was Holmes's way of letting me know the threat was truly over. Part of me felt bad about how everything had turned out. I'd never wanted Deborah to face criminal charges or be forced out of the neighborhood. All I'd wanted was for my property rights to be respected. But she'd made choice after choice that escalated the situation, and eventually, those choices had consequences. Bill stopped by one evening in early September, carrying a bottle of bourbon. We sat on my back deck in the cooling air, watching darkness settle over the neighborhood. "Deborah's gone," he said, pouring us each a drink. "Moved out this morning. House is already listed for sale," I heard. I sipped the bourbon, feeling the burn. "Feels like the end of an era." "Good riddance to that era," Bill said. "New board is already making improvements. We're repaving the main streets next month, fixing the playground equipment, all the stuff that actually matters." How are the finances looking after paying my legal fees? Not great, but manageable. We'll recover. Some people are still salty about it, but most folks understand it was Deborah's fault for pushing a bad case. You did what you had to do. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Finally, Bill asked the question I knew was coming. You ever regret building that path? Given all the trouble it caused, I thought about it seriously. No, that path has made countless people's lives a little easier for almost 40 years. Mr. Henderson got to visit his grandson every night for the last 2 years of his life. Kids use it to get to the bus stop without walking through mud. Joggers use it. Dog walkers. It's done exactly what I built it to do. The trouble wasn't because of the path. It was because one person couldn't stand not being in control. Bill raised his glass. To standing your ground. We clinked glasses and drank. The house sold in October to a young couple with a baby. I introduced myself, welcomed them to the neighborhood, and told them the whole story about the path. They found it hilarious and promised never to complain about leaves. November brought the kind of brilliant fall weather that makes you forget Ohio winters are coming. The trees turned gold and red, and my yard filled with leaves once again. I spent a sunny Saturday afternoon blowing them into piles, moving methodically across the lawn. When I finished, I carefully blew some of the leaves onto the path, just because I could. Then I walked back inside, made myself coffee, and watched through the window as wind scattered them back across multiple properties. Nobody complained. Nobody sent violation notices. Nobody tried to fine me or claim my property or file fraudulent liens. The neighborhood had returned to what it should have been all along. People living their lives, helping each other out, respecting boundaries. I thought about calling Rachel to tell her I'd blown leaves onto the path again, knowing she'd laugh. But it didn't feel like news worth reporting anymore. It was just a Saturday afternoon, just yard work, just normal life. The whole ordeal had lasted about 9 months from start to finish. 9 months of stress, anger, legal fees, and neighborhood drama. But in the end, truth won out. Documentation mattered. Property rights mattered. Standing up for yourself mattered. December arrived with early snow. I cleared my driveway and then, out of habit and courtesy, cleared the path. Several neighbors waved thanks as they used it, walking carefully on the cleared concrete while snow continued to fall around them. This was why I'd built it. This simple act of making life a little easier for the people around me. The new HOA board sent out a newsletter highlighting neighborhood improvements and thanking residents for their cooperation. My name appeared in a section about property maintenance, praising my decades of care for the walking path and noting it as an example of good stewardship. It was a small thing, but it felt like vindication. Christmas came and went. I spent it with family again, my house full of noise and laughter and wrapping paper. My grandson had grown 3 inches since last year. My granddaughter had lost 2 teeth. Rachel looked tired but happy. Life was good. On New Year's Eve, I stood on my front porch wrapped in a heavy coat, watching fireworks explode over the neighborhood. Someone down the street was having a party, music and voices drifting through the cold air. The path stretched away into darkness, snow-covered and peaceful. I thought about that young Marine who'd bought this house 38 years ago, full of plans and energy. I thought about building the path that first summer, working until dark every evening because I'd decided something needed to be done. I thought about Mr. Henderson's grateful smile, about all the people who'd used that path over the decades, about the simple satisfaction of creating something useful that lasted. That path had been worth every dollar, every hour of work, every ounce of effort. The fight to defend it had been worth it too, even with all the stress and conflict. Some things are worth standing up for. The fireworks reached their finale, multiple explosions lighting up the sky in brilliant colors. Neighbors cheered. The new year had arrived. I went inside to warmth and quiet, made myself tea, and sat in my favorite chair with a book. Outside, the path waited under its blanket of snow, connecting houses and lives, doing its job just like it had for 38 years. Tomorrow I'd clear it again, and the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as I was able, because it was mine and I took care of what was mine. That's what you did. That's what mattered. The HOA had learned that lesson the hard way, but they'd learned it. Property rights weren't suggestions. Documentation wasn't optional, and when someone was clearly, provably, undeniably in the right, eventually justice prevailed. I opened my book and started reading, content in my home, secure in my rights, at peace with my neighborhood. The whole ridiculous conflict was over, resolved in the only way it could be. With truth winning out over bluster, with evidence trumping false claims, with one stubborn old Marine refusing to be pushed around. Sometimes that's all it takes. Someone willing to say no, to stand firm, to fight for what's right even when it's difficult. I'd done that, and I'd won. The path was mine, just like it had always been, just like the deed had said since 1987. That was the end of it. Life went on, better and calmer than before. The neighborhood healed. The HOA improved. My property rights were respected. Justice, however delayed, had been served. And every time I walked on that path, every time I maintained it or cleared it or just looked at it through my window, I felt proud. Not of the conflict or the lawsuit or watching Deborah face consequences, but of building something useful that had served my community for nearly 4 decades. That path would outlast me. Long after I was gone, it would still be there, connecting homes and neighbors, making life a little easier for everyone who used it. That was the real victory. Not the court ruling or the vindication, but the simple fact of having created something good that endured. I finished my tea and headed to bed, ready for whatever the new year would bring. Behind me, through the window, moonlight illuminated the snow-covered path, stretching away into the peaceful winter night, solid and permanent, exactly as it should be.